Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 31. I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and sometimes, like today, the history of her hometown, Fall River, Massachusetts. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens, each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel Lizzie Borden took an axe, to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Mystery Series. In this episode, we interview Fall River historian and professor emeritus of history at Bridgewater State University, Dr. Philip T. Silvia Jr. Phil has edited 3 books on the Victorian history of Fall River titled Victorian Vistas, which are considered important sources not only of the history of the region, but of labor and immigration. He has also published numerous articles in journals such as Spinner, Labor History, and Catholic Historical Review. An avid baseball fan, he's also quite well known as the historian of Fall River's professional baseballists, lecturing on the subject many times. You can watch those recorded lectures on baseball, as well as all of the other public lectures given by Dr. Silvia, by going to the website of the Fall River Historical Society. Phil's expertise in these subjects cannot be understated. Today, he has graciously agreed to be interviewed on the subject near and dear to his heart: early immigration in Fall River, the news media in the city, and how this may have impacted not only the course of Fall River's future, but also the life of one Lizzie Borden. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents an interview with Dr. Philip Silvia. Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Philip T. Silvia Jr., who is an emeritus professor of history from Bridgewater State University. Today's topic is a fall history topic with ties back to Lizzie Borden. It is entitled The Immigrant Experience in Fall River and the Power of the Printed Word, with important reference to the Borden case eventually, right?
Right.
Okay. So let's begin. Tell us about the first newspapers in Fall River, because I find this incredibly fascinating and not something that I ever thought of before when studying the Borden case.
The first Fall River newspaper was known as The Monitor, and it was published in 1826. It was printed on a Ramage press, similar to what Franklin's situation was with his press, ink distributed upon the type by rolled balls.
You mean like Benjamin Franklin?
Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
And the person, interestingly, that took advantage of this evolving technology was a Benjamin Earl, who was apprenticed and then took over by 1830 the Fall River Monitor. I'm absolutely fascinated by something we take for granted, that there's a story, and you can find the story, but how difficult it must have been for the reporters to cover the city and produce what they did on a daily basis beginning in this year. Fall River was a growing community at the time, and it was connected to the nation and not just locally involved in the reporting of the news. So that Monitor took some very important positions. One of them was to disagree with another newspaper which became its competitor. The first issue that was of importance was the question of Masonry. And there was a disappearance of an important individual in Upper New York State, and So Masonry became a big issue around the year 1830, and the accusation was that Masons had murdered a person who was going to reveal the secrecy of the organization.
So what's a Mason?
A Mason, it's a fraternal organization, and it's dedicated from its own perspective to doing good and being cooperative with one another. But it was a secret organization with different rituals, and one person threatened to reveal all of the rituals, and he was the one that disappeared. So what's important here is we have this idea of an elite organization coming up against what history is going to call Jacksonian democracy. And so the Masons were seen by their adversaries, including Benjamin Earl, as a threat to democracy. And this became a very divisive issue in the evolution of political parties.
Is that because the Masons were well-placed, important people, and it was sort of influential in the way the government was being run?
Exactly, Dr. Curry. Yeah. Jackson, of course, had 2 successful terms as president, at least if you weren't a Native American, and became synonymous with democracy. And that ties in, again, with a great national issue, the issue of Dawes Rebellion. Dawes Rebellion occurred in 1842, and it was in nearby Rhode Island. Of course, we were the border city, bumped right up against Rhode Island. And Rhode Island was an extremely politically elite community where you had to own property or pay property taxes to be a voter. And what was happening is that in the countryside you had a lot of farmers, etc., that could do so, but the towns and cities were beginning to fill with immigrants, mostly Irish, and purposely the effort was to keep the Irish from voting. They were still working under the Charter of 1663 granted by King Charles. And again, the critics said, well, this is not exactly democratic. And it led to a Thomas Dorr taking the leadership and threatening the government of Rhode Island. And there was a revolt where the Dorrites formed for a while a separate state government organization. And ultimately, the Dorr Rebellion was put down. But this is a very glaring example of the elite trying to prevent the Irish from voting once they arrived in the United States. Now, what's interesting...
So Irish weren't Masons at all?
Oh, no. In fact, the Masons were Protestants and considered by the Catholics to be anti-Catholic because of their secret nature, their secret organization.
I see.
Now, a Lewis Lapham came to Fall River because Dorr ended up being jailed in his failed effort to spread democracy in Rhode Island. But Lewis Lapham was a person obviously committed to an expanding democracy, and when he came to Fall River, which he did, he ultimately became a judge, but also a newspaper editor. And so he pushed Democratic Party ideology through a newspaper.
You mean Democratic with a small d or a big D?
Big D.
Okay.
But it could be a small d as well because of the desire to expand citizenship and the ability to vote.
So he was a judge and a publisher and an editor.
Yes.
That's an interesting combination.
It is. It is. And he's also a non-Catholic Democrat.
What does that mean, non-Catholic? Protestant?
Protestant.
Okay.
He is one element of the emerging Democratic Party, which we'll talk about later. But I'd like to also reference the Weekly News. This newspaper from 1845 was published by Almy and Milne, and importantly, in the 1850s, the Fall River Daily Evening News became a Republican, capital R, newspaper. The Republican Party supplanted the Whig Party. The Whig Party basically had been very strong and competitive for about 20 years, but the Whig Party did not do well at the beginning of the 1850s, and some people evolved towards a new party, and by 1856 we had today's Republican Party established. So this is a very, very significant change, Almy and Milne, because the Democratic Party became associated as the working class party. And Almy and Milne were fervent anti-slavery people. And that's, from our perspective, a very positive thing. But once they became Republicans, the newspaper was, if you will, Fall River's elite newspaper, Fall River's Protestant newspaper. So the stage is going to be set for the struggle, the political struggle that we're going to focus upon today.
So at the same time the weekly news is being published, you have the Monitor?
Yes, the Monitor, I'm forgetting how far that went along at this time. We had many, many newspapers. Some of them would last for 4 months, a couple of years, and a lot of them were ideological. There'd be some specific issue that the editor would be pushing.
Right.
But basically, the important thing to remember is that the news, the daily news, became the Republican Party organ.
So that's very unlike what we think about journalism and newspapers today. We think of them as nonpartisan. We think of them as, and importantly, that they don't take a position. That's for the opinion section, I guess, of the newspaper, where editorial boards choose or endorse candidates or have a say in politics. But the rest of the newspaper is supposed to be nonpartisan. But what we're talking about here is an entire newspaper devoted to a political philosophy and filtering the news that way. Is that right?
Absolutely, very perceptive on your part, Dr. Curry. But it's that's basically what has happened.
Is that the way it was throughout the nation?
Yes, there was always a polarization. I mean, we're coming to the Civil War,
right?
And
yeah, but I'm thinking in terms of like newspapers, because it's
the newspapers, they reported the local news particularly, but they did that with a slant, and it was a reflection of what they believed as terms of national issues and what was. It's just the same as today. People talk about the polarization, but there was similar polarization with the newspaper press at this time, and we'll talk some more about that as we go along.
Well,
there's plenty of examples.
How can you then? Okay, what are your praises for the early press?
My praises are, as I said before, the gathering of news,
Right.
how difficult it was. Think of the transportation problem, just getting to and from whatever the source of news might be.
Horses, right?
And working on the pressure of having to have a daily publication. It was, I think, meeting a time deadline was really significant back at this point.
And expensive, wouldn't it be?
I would think it was expensive. And then, the process of selling the newspapers, et cetera, and trying to
Were the printing presses in the city in Fall?
Oh, yeah.
They didn't have to send it out?
No. There were printing presses for certain. In fact, there's a very interesting issue in the 1870s that I don't want to forget to mention about that. So, again, we can praise the early press for the difficult assignment they had.
Right.
And the accomplishment is something that, of course, historians are extremely appreciative of. But as we're reading the news, we have to look, as you said, at what's objective and what's subjective. And the editorial page was always subjective. And the interpretation of news was reflected in that. Again, we'll talk about polarization.
So if you had a newspaper like the Fall River Daily Evening News, which was
Republican and Protestant.
Republican, Protestant, but anti-slavery.
But anti-slavery. And that's very interesting because if we look back and we want to take sides, the anti-slavery part is very significant. And the Irish Democratic press is less than friendly when it comes to the slavery issue.
Oh, really?
Oh, very much so.
Okay.
And,
so it's
many people have seen the Gangs of New York, and
Right.
how it's the Democratic Party. Tammany Hall was taken over, if you will, by the Irish over time. And
so the corruption was significant in that regard?
Corruption in what sense?
Tammany Hall, the idea that the big bosses were Irish. This is New York we're talking about now, but
It is New York, but it's emulated over time in places like Fall River, which again we'll get into. The criticism of Tammany Hall is understandable, but the Irish, as we'll see, were almost defenseless when they arrived here, and so they were able to integrate themselves and then try to integrate into the greater society. And Tammany Hall did a lot of good things from, say, an Irish perspective. It protected you from the law sometimes. It assured you government positions at all different levels over time. And it also had a sense of the common good many times and took care of the indigent ethnic Irish when they were in need and could not get support from a laissez-faire city government.
Interesting. So why did the Irish come to Fall River? Why here? Was it just for mill jobs?
Well, it soon became for mill jobs, but they came here locally from the western part of Ireland in many cases to take skills that they had learned in mining. And
Copper mining, right?
There were mines and coal mines in Portsmouth, Rhode Island.
I see.
And if you remember, Reverend Avery
yes, he of Sarah Cornell
claimed
fame.
that he never came to Fall River, but he was a student of nature, and so he went on a nature walk to look at the mines.
Oh, that's right.
On the day that a young woman lost her life.
That's right.
At the Borden farm in
the
Fall
Durfee
River.
Farm.
The Durfee farm, yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
So mines right over the river.
And interestingly, over time, opportunities to go to work elsewhere, and there's a split. Some people went to Newport, some people went to Fall River.
Now, were the Irish predominantly Catholic, or was there...
The Irish were overwhelmingly Catholic.
Okay, but there was a Protestant...
There was a small Protestant component.
But it was the Catholics that were fleeing... The Catholic Irish were fleeing Ireland.
The Catholic Irish were fleeing Ireland prior to the potato famine. There were probably 50,000 Irish residents of London and Liverpool at this time. And that's very important when we talk about the evolution of the Irish into the mills, because the Irish arrived with the advantage, although that many of them still spoke Gaelic, but they arrived basically with the language that would help them integrate into the society, unlike, say, the French.
Right.
And
the Portuguese.
And most of the ethnic groups that came, other than, the Scots. And that's interesting, too. I've said it many times. I've read so many issues of newspapers in Fall River. I never saw a negative comment about Scottish immigrants. And there was always major reporting of their sporting Caledonian games. So it's interesting because we think that every group has been discriminated against. And maybe if you were Scotch, you thought there was something that was discriminatory, but I get the sense that they were well received from the very beginning and seen as a positive newcomer group to the city.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So
the Irish, as I said, some of them were attracted to that skill, that unique skill that they had, and then they heard that things were going on in Fall River. So the Irish eventually, probably most important, the sturdy sons of Erin, said one Protestant minister, helped to rebuild the city of Fall River after the Great Fire of 1843.
Quickly, too.
Quickly. There was an appreciation of that. That was one of the positive things about the Irish, that their labor was so essential after the Great Fire. The Irish arrived with that opportunity, and there's something very interesting about, and I want to read it, if I may. It's called Vicious Boys, and this is at the time of the Great Fire. Now, in my mind, I thought of Old Fall River as Yankee, Protestant, law and order, a tight-knit community, a homogeneous community, and also sort of an authoritarian community where, there was a patriarchal system. There were a lot of stern fathers, and they didn't mind chastising children with physical punishment for misbehavior. So you think that maybe it's a near perfect social situation, and that the Irish come in and there's mayhem. Mm-hmm. But this is a wonderful contradiction of that thought. The headline is Vicious Boys, and it's asking the police, the constables, and the officers of the city to help these petitioners, who they humbly represent and complain that being possessed of real estate, they are infested the peace and quietness of their living by the disorderly conduct of the youth of Fall River, who by rapping at doors or throwing stones at houses or exploding firecrackers near them are wantonly breaking the enjoyment of that we typically had. So pre-Irish, you've got a bunch of juvenile delinquents.
Well, wasn't it the start of the fire in 1843 was two little kids playing
as they should not have been.
Yes.
Supposedly with a cannon that ignited
in
fire.
hay.
Right.
In a barn.
Right. So
during a heat wave with no rain around the 4th of July.
Not a good situation. So I just want to let the listeners realize that it wasn't perfect. And because it wasn't perfect, and because the Irish were now coming in, the citizens of the community established a night watch in 1844. And the new town hall had a lockup. So for the first time, the taxpayers are deciding we have to spend money to bring about law and order in our society.
And this is 1844.
This is right after the fire. And so what happens in time is you have a volunteer night watch.
Like the fire department, it's a volunteer.
Yeah. All the citizens would take their turn until the violence got out of hand. And it did get out of hand. And I have some wonderful material that I'd like to take the time to talk about, because you had people one of the volunteers kept a journal. I went to the watch house for my book and rattle and lantern. So at nighttime, they've got a lantern, and I guess if there's trouble, they have a rattle that can attract other volunteers if necessary. I heard a noise on Main Street. I went there and found a man singing and hollering. I stopped him and asked him to stop the noise, and he said he would. And I told him to go. He went a few yards and began again, repeated singing and bellowing, and two ladies came out and hollered and cried out. Then I took the man, William McCarthy, and told him he must go to the watch house. So another expense of poor farm. And so they would have to start to deal with people who are indigent. So it's a combination. I guess if you're doing this, it's not fun, but it's fun to read about. March 10th, found an Irishman in a gentleman's yard drunk and asleep. He snored so loud he woke the gentleman of the house, and he called the watch. We took him to the watch house and kept him till morning. March 14th, Friday, the watch was called up to take a drunken Irishman to the watch house. He had fell over the table and capsized it and broke dishes. His name is Thomas Sullivan. But this could happen as well. March 17, St. Patrick's Day, Monday morning. There was a great deal of passing in the street all through the night, but no trouble.
Wow.
So
that's St. Patrick's Day.
That is.
Wow.
That is. Here's another beautiful. About 10 o'clock, there was a noise on the lower end of Spring Street, so that's right near where the Borden residence would be.
Right.
One man, called the stoutest of the Irish, pitched upon the watch. They tumbled together into the street, where a mob of about 50 gathered, and everyone that could reach beat and bruised the watch until he fought his way through and alarmed the rest of the watch. But when they got there, they had made their escape into the rum shops. So guess what?
What?
The volunteers decided, let's raise the tax rate even on ourselves so we can have a regular police force.
Did they still call them a watch?
No, they had
a constabulary.
They had constables and a police force.
And a police force.
But again, they can take the lumps that we've been taking, so why not pay to get away from this nightmare?
Yeah, really, if it's a volunteer. I know that the fire department, if you were a volunteer fireman, you had to have your own bucket. You were allowed to vote. In other words, you didn't have to pay a poll tax. You got your poll tax eliminated.
Okay.
And that was sort of, I guess, about 50 cents. It was like worth it for them to do it for that reason, I guess, that they could vote. Well, how did the Irish become established then in the state, in the city?
Okay. Well, we have to go back to the 1820s when there were a sparse number of Catholics in the city. And there was a family, the father was Patrick Kennedy, and Patrick Kennedy was a watchman at one of the mills. And he and Mrs. Kennedy had, I believe, 5 children. Patrick was very devoted to his Catholicism to the point where he would walk to Boston once a year to do his so-called Easter duty and receive communion, etc., because there was no priest in the area. So the first priests were sort of missionary priests, and their responsibilities were large. St. Mary's Church is across the Cathedral Church in Fall River, but it began as St. John's Chapel in the 1830s, a wooden structure. And once that happened, there was the ability to have a pastor assigned permanently to St. John's. But oftentimes, in other areas, a priest would come by on a missionary basis and maybe say a mass every 1 or 3 months. The Kennedys, this happens so tragically so often. Patrick Kennedy was trying to chop ice off a water wheel in cold weather, and he slipped and died. And Mrs. Kennedy was left with her brood of children, and so she formed a boarding house. And Catholics went to her boarding house. Even the first pastor lived in a boarding house for a while. And what happened was Mrs. Kennedy had a table, and that's where the first Mass was celebrated, in her home in the 1820s. Again, there weren't a lot of people that were Irish. But the Irish were coming in later, and so the St. Mary's Church ultimately was built in the 1850s, and Dr. Richard Grace was interviewed yesterday by Dan Medeiros and had a good article about his research on the history of St. Mary's, which is absolutely fascinating.
So the wooden church, St. John's, was there first, and then they built St. Mary's around it, didn't they?
They did. That you've learned your local history.
Yes, they built the church. They built the cathedral around the church, and it wasn't until the cathedral was finished that they took the church down inside and removed it.
Correct, but.
Is that so that people could go to church while the church was being built? Yes.
Well, interestingly, and this is becoming important in terms of where we're going in terms of the social tensions, the chapel was set on fire in 1837 by anti-Catholic bigots and was partially destroyed. And that will lead us into some of a worse situation. But you're right. In the 1850s, St. Mary's Church was constructed and dedicated. I think it was in 1856 that the present edifice was completed without the steeple, and then the steeple was erected a couple of years later. Yes, they waited to a certain point in time. I think 3 sides of the new church were constructed, and maybe the start of the 4th, and they cut the chapel in half and moved it to another location where I believe it served as a school for a number of years.
So what's this anti-Catholic sentiment? It's not anti-Irish, it's anti-Catholic, correct?
It's both. It's one and the same at this point.
Right, one and the same, right.
Because the other immigrants that are coming into the city are English, and the English, when they arrive, are Protestants. So they're sort of tacked on to the native.
Right.
The native
Yankee.
people.
So you've got...
So the Yankees and the English will be Republican Party advocates.
Right. So you've got the Protestants, but every immigrant group that comes in besides the English are Catholic. The French Canadians are Catholic, the Irish are Catholic, the Portuguese are Catholic.
Right.
So things change eventually with just the grand number of immigrants that come to
the English and the Scots Protestant. And
they're from here. Well,
no.
The Protestants are from here.
Well, the Native American, let's call them, that'll confuse us with Native American Indians, but that's why I like to use the term Yankee, because it's the original English immigrants
who were
are
from
now
Pilgrims.
English Americans over time.
Right.
And of course, as we know, we started with Plymouth and that type of thing. So Catholicism was new to Fall River when the Irish started coming in.
Okay, and they were the first Catholic immigrant group.
Correct.
So
Correct.
were the Irish regarded as a curse or a blessing?
Well, it depends. The Irish would consider themselves a blessing, but...
But of course.
And they were, in many respects. The tremendous sense of faith. Many of you, depending on your age, would remember the name Jim O'Brien, a very gregarious state representative, and they were members of St. Mary's Parish. Jim's wife, Gert, was a very pious woman, very, very involved with church activities. And I told her something. One person called it God's night work, but much of the construction of the church was done on a volunteer basis with people with masonry and other skills. And a Peter Gaffney and a Walter Conroy, I believe those are the two names, were killed while working on the church, where they were working as volunteers after their long day of work elsewhere. And so, again, someone called it God's night work. Gert O'Brien would have a mass said in memory of those two people every year after I told her about what had happened with them.
Oh, wow.
But the driving force here is Father Edward Murphy. Father Murphy represents the Irish like no one else in Fall River. He actually did Indian missionary work in Maine, but he arrived here, and now there were enough Irish to support a permanent pastor. And so Father Murphy is the religious person of Fall River.
And what year we're talking about here?
From 1840 to 1887.
Wow.
Father Murphy was the dominant pastor. You did, by the way, mention the cathedral, Stephanie, and that's not correct until the Diocese of Fall River was formed.
Okay.
And then it became the cathedral parishes. As Dr. Grace mentions, it has nothing to do with the size of the school, of the church, or how beautiful it might be, or how large it might be. It has to do with, that's the bishop's church.
Okay. Oh, right.
That's
okay.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
Because at the
and I should know better.
Oh, that's all right. But at the beginning, Fall River was part of the Boston Diocese, and it wasn't until 1872 that Fall River was part of the Providence Diocese, and so it's.
And then when did it become the Fall River Diocese? Yes,
in 1904.
Yeah.
And the first bishop will be Bishop Stang. Well, getting back to your question, though, there is the curse component.
The curse, which is alcohol, is that right?
Well, it could be. There's a lot of alcohol related. The Irish could be regarded as stupid by their critics. There was a census taker that felt that way and talked about, hilariously, taking the census about two Donlans, and it said, it gave the father's name, and the occupation was doing nothing, and then it gave the son's name, and it said helping his father.
Oh, no.
So there was this idea that a lot of the Irish were not hard workers, contradicting what we've just been talking about, and were looking for handouts from the government. On the other hand, there was some funny appreciation of the Irish. The other things I think are hilarious are American letters. Now, we have to understand, again, talking about the printed press, letters were the most important thing for an immigrant. You could be induced to come by a steamship agency in time, by a padrone, by anyone. But who would you trust that things are really good in Fall River? This is a place you'd go. So American letters going both ways are great for historians of immigration. Some of them talk about the Irish in a way back home. So just an example of somebody who's back home writing to someone who's, say, in Fall River or elsewhere. Dear son, just a few lines to let you know that I'm still alive. I'm writing this letter slowly because I know you cannot read fast. About your father, he has a lovely new job. He has 500 men under him. He's cutting grass at the cemetery. And then for indoor plumbing. There was a washing machine in the new house when we moved in, but it isn't working too good. Last week I put 14 shirts into it, pulled the chain, and I haven't seen the shirt since. Your Uncle Dick drowned last week in a vat of whiskey in a Dublin brewery. Some of his workers dived in to save him, but he fought them off bravely. They cremated his body, and it took 3 days for the fire to go out. Your father didn't have much to drink at Christmas. I put a bottle of castor oil in his pint of beer. It kept him going till New Year's Day. I went to the doctor on Thursday. Your father came with me. The doctor put a small tube in my mouth and told me not to open it for 10 minutes. Your father offered to buy it from the doctor. And you'd usually find this in the Irish letters. Your loving mother, P.S. I was going to send you $10, but I already sealed the envelope. And there's a similar one, but this is important because it talks about the old world hostilities between the oppressed Irish and the English overlords. And so this is another supposed letter written from Ireland in the 1850s. Dear cousin, you have gone high places in America. God bless you. I hope you'll not be putting on airs and forgetting your native land. Your cousin Hughie O'Toole was hung in Londonderry last week for killing a bobby. May God rest his soul, and may God curse Jimmy Roger, the informer, and may he burn in hell. God forgive me. We had a grand time at Pat Muldoon's wake. He's an old blatherskite, and it seemed good to see him stretched out with his big mouth shut. He's better off dead, and may he burn until the damn place freezes over. God forgive me. He had too many friends among the Orangemen, the Irish, the Port Protestants. God cursed a lot of them. Bless your heart. I almost forgot to tell you about your Uncle Dinny. He took a pot shot at a turncoat from the back of a hedge, but Dinny had had too much to drink and missed. God curse the dirty drink. I hope this letter finds you in good health, and may God keep reminding you to keep sending the money. Father Flaherty, who baptized you, is now feeble-minded. Your devoted cousin Timothy. P.S. Things look bright again. Every police barracks and Protestant church has been burned to the ground in the county. Thanks be to God. P.P.S. Keep sending the money. And the Irish were remarkable. They spent thousands. There's one record of the Irish in January of 1843, say, sending $2,500 back home in the first month. And these are people that were working for $1 a day. So there was that connection.
Did it enable them to the rest of the family to immigrate?
Very much. It could. It could. That would be the goal in many cases.
So I read a book called An Irish Boy in Fall River.
Yes.
Is that what it's called?
Yes, excellent. Yeah, David Lawler.
David Lawler, and he talks about his father coming over first, going to Boston, finding out that there's work in Fall River and that they're hiring children. Goes down to Fall River, checks out the place, and then sends for his family. And they come over, and the kids work in the mills. And David is witness to the Granite Mill fire in 1874 because he's in the other mill, and he watches it burn, and he describes the horrific scene before him as people are jumping from the windows because the ladders don't reach to the section where the women and the children are on the top level of the mill, and that the fire had gone up the one staircase, single staircase, that there was in the mill. But luckily from all of that, new laws were enacted for mill safety, including fire suppressant systems and multiple entrances and exits. But that's, laws were enacted after that. But it was a horrible tragedy. And I noticed the names of the dead, and they were all Irish, it felt like. They were Murphys and Sullivans and O'Tooles. And in one case, there were several people of the same family, two sisters in the same family.
By the 1850s, of course, the opportunities for work had increased. There was an expansion of number of mills, etc. So the Irish form a very important component of the city by 1854. Now, 1854 is the year where Fall River becomes a city. And so for the first time, we'll have a mayor-elect, we'll have a 6 wards. Each ward will have an alderman, and each ward will have someone that belongs to the city council. There'll be 3 from each area, so from each of the 6 wards. So the idea was that the alderman was supposed to sort of look at the city as a whole and try to pass legislation that would help everyone. But the idea of the city council, the 3 of each 6 wards, would be more focused on bringing whatever government assistance there could be to their particular ward, whether it was getting roads paved or curbing put in or whatever. So that would be the typical struggle. Everybody that was elected to office in 1854 belonged to the newly formed American Party. That's the party that is popularly known as the Know Nothing Party. And again, supposedly, if a member was asked about what the party was all about, you'd say, I know nothing. But what's important to remember now is that the city fathers were all dedicated to being anti-Catholic. That's the chasm that exists in 1854.
Can you explain this concept of know nothing, how that's a positive?
No, it's not a positive.
But they were the Know Nothing Party.
It was the Know Nothing Party, and eventually...
yeah, but why call yourself something that sounds so negative?
No, they call themselves the American Party.
Oh, okay. It was badly, pejoratively referred to as the Know
Yes,
Nothing Party.
yes,
I see.
okay.
Got it.
So they're dedicated to trying to restrict, especially to try to keep the Irish from voting and gaining any kind of political strength.
And this is in the very beginning of the Fall
This
River
is the
becoming
beginning
a
of the
city.
city.
Yeah.
And we talk about the founding fathers, but this shows the polarization and the bigotry at its apex.
At the very beginning.
At the very beginning.
All anti-Irish.
And that includes the first mayor, James Buffington. But what happened over time is that the Know-Nothings failed, and most of them joined the new Republican Party, including Mayor Buffington, who would go on to a career in Washington as a national representative and claimed to be a friend of Abraham Lincoln. James Buffington was brought up as a Quaker and had a very interesting... He actually went on a whaling voyage and trained to be a doctor under Thomas Wilbur, who was the lead physician in the Avery murder case. And then he ended up using his medical knowledge to have what we would call a drugstore. What also happens in 1844, the cholera is coming. The cholera is coming.
Oh, yes.
And so we have the Asiatic cholera coming up the eastern seaboard, and it would almost be like if soldiers were marching towards you. You're hoping that the city will not encounter this dread disease. But it does, and the Irish are blamed. Specifically, Jeremiah Holland. Now, he's not to blame. He died. He was the first Irishman to contract the cholera. And his wife said she didn't want to bury him while he was almost warm. And so she held a wake, much to the consternation of Father Murphy. And the Irish began to succumb to this terrible dread disease. Buffington, in an annual message, blamed the Irish and said too many of them keep swine too close to their residences, and also they have imbibed in drinking too heavily, and so critics called it the Catholic cholera. The situation was such that we actually stopped allowing vessels to come into Fall River from elsewhere. There'd be somebody standing with a trumpet border of Rhode Island, and at first they disallowed them, and then they allowed some fumigation to take place. But this was a terrible, terrible crisis, and the Irish are the one that is succumbing the most, and you would think that the situation is certainly stacked against them with what we've just described, the belief of the governing people in the city. But it's not the creed, but the need, as it was said, James Buffington, when he faces the reality, is a hero in my estimation. He works with Father Murphy. They transport sick people to a temporary hospital. They help bury sick people at risk to their own health. And so I've always thought that, this is a marvelous story of people overcoming their prejudice and helping rather than hindering people.
Didn't they try to outlaw or dissuade people from having wakes when people died so that there wouldn't be a transfer?
Right, just the transfer. And the Great Crisis finally passed. The monitor, the monitor was still there, and it was the most anti-Catholic. It was putting the worst things in on a daily basis about what was happening. And what was really interesting, they said, well, finally 126 people died of the cholera, but only 10 Americans. So that was their perspective. And the monitor said they were dying off like rotten sheep because their prejudiced priests that keep them in superstition couldn't control them. So you've got that undercurrent of, to say the least, hostility. But again, Mayor Buffington is very special, I think, and Father Murphy in doing what they did. On a lesser note, 1857 is a great panic year in the nation. The economy goes sour badly, and the Irish are facing unemployment. Some of them at this point are working at Oak Grove Cemetery, a newly developed public cemetery. And our third mayor, Nathaniel Borden, pays them even during the cold months when it's hard to bury anyone. Mm-hmm. And so what we have here is inefficiency from a taxpayer's point of view, but a necessary pay to keep families together of Irish-American extraction. So what's very interesting is the next election brings in Josiah Blaisdell, who ends up being very involved as a judge in our community. And
Lizzie connection, big time.
Big time.
Yeah.
I think he had tears in his eyes when he had to sort of say, Lizzie, I'm afraid that things are not trending in your direction. But what's really interesting is he was elected by the taxpayers with the purpose of cutting the tax rate and dismissing these workers. So Blaisdell had no sympathy for the working class, and that continued throughout his judicial career.
He was a hard man.
He was a hard man, and again, he was elected to be a hard man by people who obviously...
No, he was elected because he was a hard man.
Absolutely.
I mean, he started that way.
He did.
And he lived his entire life like that.
Right. And I really wanted to make that connection with you because I think it's so significant over time.
He was very firm in his belief about things and just made decisions as a judge based on him being right all the time. And the way he interpreted it could not be questioned.
And he was a stockholder in the mills.
Yes, he was.
Now, I thought there was enough material to write a juicy article about what we've been talking about. But I really felt it was essential to get more of the total anti-Catholic flavor of the Monitor. I remember that I felt if I could find more in the Monitor, I think someone at a professional journal would accept an article about the 1850s in Fall River.
Uh-huh.
This is an existential story. I am teaching at Bridgewater State, and I love what I'm doing, but I tell my students one day, I can't wait for these classes to be over because I'm going to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, to look at copies of the Fall River Monitor. And what had happened was I did the research, and for some reason this one library in the whole world had copies of the Monitor for the year that I needed. So I was so excited. And I went back between classes to the office and said, "You've got a call from the library." And they had told me they would welcome me, and we had arranged time. And the person at the other end of the line said, "Hi, I've got some bad news for you. You need not come to us today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, there's a problem." I said, "Was it incorrect? You don't have this year's copy of the newspaper?" "Oh, we have it." "Well, why can't I look at it?" Silverfish insects had infiltrated and were eating the paper. So again, it was so surreal. They said you could touch the paper, it would disintegrate. You couldn't even turn a page. So there was one copy left in the world, but there was really no copies left in the world.
Wow.
And the article was never written.
Oh.
And that says so much about historical research. How you have successes and great findings, but you also come to dead ends.
Oh, a lot of dead ends.
Yeah, and isn't it frustrating when
It
that
is.
happens?
It is, and then you go, okay, there's got to be another way, and then you try something else, and you make your phone calls, and you send your emails, and you get back no help. It's not possible. So you try somewhere else. You look at family papers, and you look at, where did somebody leave their stuff, and you try to find family members, and you're trying desperately. And if you hit a generation that doesn't care or didn't care about their family history, you're that's the end of the road.
Well, certainly with the absence of printed exchanges, it's going to be more difficult for today's historians to do research. So by 1854, though, the important thing is if you look at the city directory, there are more Sullivans and O'Sullivans.
There are hundreds of Sullivans. Yeah.
So the Irish are just flourishing.
What were the leading immigration developments after the Civil War?
Okay, the Irish immigration continued, but it slowed down.
When was the potato famine?
1845, 6, 7, in that period. People think that, all the Irish came because of the potato famine. As we just indicated, the Catholic Church St. Mary's was well established. About 25% of the population, of the Irish population, was here before 1840. So there was a core that were here and were progressing.
Were they all living in what we now know as Corky Row area, or were they dispersed around the city?
They were dispersed because of the mills, but they were heavily concentrated in the Corky Row area, and that's where the church was. And we'll tie that together, I think, with Lizzie Borden in good time. But what is very significant, of course, is the influx of the French Canadians after the Civil War. And they start slowly, and then they accelerate and become numerically the dominant group in the city by 1900.
Bringing with them customs, Catholicism,
indeed,
French language, tradition. Food, culture, and they congregated and lived together in groups.
But a lack of the English language, which makes it easier to discriminate against them compared to any other group that had come in before.
But they have their own newspaper, right?
They do. Right? And, we've talked about, and I've written about what's called the Flint Affair. And the Flint Affair by the 1880s shows the new discord, and it's within the Catholic population. The Universal Catholic Church does not play out well. There's a tremendous sense of rivalry, antagonism. It's economic competition. The French are led by a very important Father Bedard, pastor of Notre Dame Church. But there are strikes in which Father Bedard encourages the French to stay at work. And the Irish and the English are the ones that are striking. And so that just accelerates the animosity. And we had the culmination of all that with the closing of Notre Dame Church by the Irish Bishop of Providence and the establishment of the Immaculate Conception Church in the Flint, which allowed the minority number of Irish to leave Notre Dame Church, and they were very happy to do so and have their own so-called Irish Catholic Church. That's where the press, again, gets incredibly subjective. The Irish have a press, which we'll talk about, And their interpretation of what's going on at Notre Dame is sometimes ludicrous, talking about the rebels have children that are born with horns on their head because their parents are in association with the devil in opposing what Bishop Hendrick and the Irish bishop wants for them. So they're the naughty ones of Notre Dame, as the Irish-dominated press suggested. The thing about the French, though, is they always had a small group of professionals, physicians, lawyers, etc., who took umbrage at the common criticisms of their day and fought back in print. And that brings us to two things, what we're talking about, but also the labor situation in Fall River. By the 1870s, there was an organization called the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it was led by one Carroll Wright. Carroll Wright was a statistician, and he was so good that he ended up being the person at the head of the census in the United States Census for a number of years. The Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics was the first of its kind in the nation. And what it did was it sent out people to investigate situations and report upon them. And it's a gold mine. It's the opposite of silverfish. There is such detail, wonderful detail, primary source material about the strikes in Fall River in the 1870s that we would never have, except that this bureau was in the forefront of gathering such items and interviewing people, very sympathetic to the workers overall in its treatment on an annual basis, to the point where conservatives tried to influence the political system to not fund the MSBL. And they were unsuccessful, and it continued. And I'm forever grateful. I mean, if you ever have a chance to look at their description of what went on in the 1870s and the mayhem in Fall River. So there's a story I wanted to go back to, and it has to do with what we talked about in 1854 in the anti-Catholicism. And it's called Christmas at Dawn, and it's by a Doran Hurley. Doran Hurley was a newspaper man. He wrote in novel form several books that are really pretty factual with the changing of names. One of them is the Monsignor, and the Monsignor was definitely supposed to be about the life of Bishop James Cassidy, who was the all-powerful bishop in Fall River for a number of years. But he wrote this Christmas at Dawn, which sort of says everything about the hostility of the time. And the story goes this way. Young Doran Hurley says he was with some of his friends, and they were down by Crab Pond, and they threw rocks at the witch that lived there, the gimpy witch that lived there. And he said, I had a most loving mother who slapped me in the face and would not talk to him. And finally, an aunt explained something, because he remembered his mother said, Mary the Bell, a son of mine, a child of mine, would be abusive toward Mary the Bell Sullivan. What she's talking about is that Christmas Day, it was a work day, because the Protestant leadership, mill-owning community felt that Christmas Day was a popish day. Father Murphy would say a mass, Christmas Day Mass, at 5 a.m. so that the workers could report to work at 6 a.m. for a 12-hour workday on Christmas. There was a particular person, and he uses the name Mather, which would get us back to the Puritan clerics of colonial times, but there's a particularly vindictive anti-worker, anti-Catholic mill owner. And he tells his workers, Christmas is coming, and you will report to work at 4 a.m. or you will be dismissed. And then he said in passing, if any of you ever got here early, I'd declare a holiday. He said it with a great sense of sarcasm. So there was a young 12-year-old girl situated probably behind the adults, and she heard that. And so it's Christmas Eve, and there's no clocks, there's no watches, etc. So young Mary says rosaries. She keeps praying, and she tries to judge how much time has passed. And she finally sneaks out of her dwelling and goes to the mill, breaks into the mill, and ascends a tower, grabs a rope, and hangs from it, and the bell starts to ring. And so the workers get up, and they're tired, and they're saying, I know we have to get there for 4 o'clock, but it seems like we just went to sleep. And of course, it's because it's before 4 o'clock. So when the workers arrive, they find that Mary has fallen after pulling the bell, and she's crippled, but she says to them, he said he would give us a holiday if you got here early. And so the story gets out, and supposedly everybody gathers at church, and Father Murphy says, henceforth, no one will go to work on Christmas Day. And so Mary the Bell became this heroic woman as she grew older. The old-timers remembered her. How much of this is true? I don't know, Stephanie. But it says everything about the tensions of the time, including Mather himself is awakened earlier than he expects by the sound of his mill bell, and supposedly he heads toward the mill, and he's intercepted and badly beaten by someone. So it's a great story in terms of everything we've been talking about. Mather being a know-nothing type, and yet the Catholic community ultimately responding in the way they did. And Darnhill knew a lot about Fall River history, and I'm sure part of it is apocryphal, but I think it wonderfully captures the tension of the times. There was a labor journal in the 1870s.
In Fall River?
In Fall River.
Okay.
And it's a remarkable journal, and its editor was George Gunton. And George Gunton was a leading radical labor organizer in the 1870s. And he was very, very involved with supporting the workers. The 1870s were a very hard time economically, and workers' wages were cut something like 45% during the 1870s. And there were violent protests, as I said, which were intensely reported by the MSBL. And just wonderful we have that. But we also have Clinton himself protesting through his newspaper. In 1878, if I could read this, there was a protest parade. That demonstration, which carried the largest number of flaming mottos on canvas ever taken through the streets of any city in America. So the 1870s was a time of complete polarization of Fall River society. And it was the closest we ever came to being almost a socialist community. There were thousands of people that believed that management should be directly challenged, and they were. There were some protests that actually went into the lower highlands, parades, and it's just almost fun to read about the resistance of the 1870s and George Gunton. And he's a little guy, and he's got an impudent face, according to one of his critics. And the Atlantic Monthly, which is the journal of the day, has an article about Gunton's paper, which was called the Labor Standard. It's interesting. The Labor Standard was published in Fall River and in a similar community, Paterson, New Jersey. Its tone and spirit are indescribably bitter and expressive of intense hostility against the possessors of property and culture. It represents capitalists as a class of cruel and inhuman oppressors and instructs the working people that the time is at hand for them to seize the rights to which they have long been denied. George Gunton was unsuccessful ultimately in Fall River. There was a time where he could not support his family. He reported that he didn't eat for, I think it was 24 hours. It could have been 48 hours. And George Gunton, impoverished, runs for political office, is soundly defeated, and leaves Fall River. And then he becomes Professor Gunton over time. Now, here's a person who was a farm boy, but he must have had a wonderful intellect and a great desire to read and learn. And so he ends up co-authoring some 6 books on economics, and he ends up with Gunton Institute in New York City. And people come and listen to his brand of economic determinism. He has his own Gunton's magazine. People like Teddy Roosevelt come and deliver talks to his students. And so now he has done a complete turnabout. He becomes probably the best promoter of American capitalism that you could imagine. He said that wealth should be limitless and accumulation is all that really counts because it promotes the economy.
How did that happen?
I think he took his lumps. I think he just converted in time.
You could see,
but but there's an intellectual justification of all of this. He believes in conspicuous consumption. That's his message. And the more that you build something or create something, the more people, including the working class, will benefit. So if you have a 500-room estate, that's fabulous. It's almost like the McMansions that we talk about that people have today, where by some standards you'd say, don't you think you're overdoing this? Why do you have to have 40,000 square feet? But I think that just goes through history when people built castles or whatever.
It's not the case where they become a part of the upper class financially, and so then they switch and become a Republican that says, lower taxes, please?
Well, that it's a trend in our society for certain. I think you can see it with the Irish American community in my lifetime, where everybody was, a Kennedy Democrat or a Johnson Democrat.
I think in France, you're not allowed to be a billionaire. They just cap how much money you're allowed to make, because there's such a thing as too much.
Yes, well, he disagreed and just said encourage capitalism without restraint and it will be good for everyone. And so in 1899, he's invited back to a place like the Quikrishan Club, and he's introduced by a conservative Fall River mayor who says this man was radical in his early life, quote, but by earnest thought he had educated himself to that point which appealed to the minds of intelligent people. So George Gunton, the economic conservative and defender of unlimited capitalism, is now, in a sense, wined and dined by the mill elite of Fall River, Massachusetts. Gunton, by the way, went on to have some scandalous marriages, and his last one was to a Southern woman who was extremely well off. So George Gunton ended up with a great deal of material security that was denied him in his Fall River days.
Do you find that hypocritical?
I find him rationalizing.
Rationalizing himself
internally, what his belief. I think he understood something about our society. You weren't going to defeat the capitalists.
No,
he came to that realization. He thought he came close.
So is it you can't beat him, join him?
Yes, but not. He claimed he was still a friend of the working class. In other words, the capitalists were going to improve society.
Down their economy. That never happens.
Well, that was his belief, and he articulated in thoughtful books. I mean, that you had to be sort of erudite or at least learned about economics to follow Gunton.
I think you lost me on him. He doesn't sound like somebody I would look up to. Maybe
Well,
as a rabble-rouser and a friend of the working class in the beginning.
he was. He was of the working class, and he was a friend of the working class.
Did he leave all his money to the working class?
I don't know that.
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so.
No.
His last wife, that brought him a lot of economic security, headed a women's organization that was noted for trying to increase segregation throughout the United States.
Oh, he just sounds more and more like someone I'm not interested in getting to know.
I don't think you would have been bosom friends.
So he's not a Quaker. Let's put it that way.
But let me talk about someone named John Collins, who emerged as one of the most successful members of the Irish American community.
In Fall River?
In Fall River.
Okay.
And Michael Martins has shown me a portrait of John Collins, which hangs, or was hanging, may hang again, at the Fall River Historical Society. And Collins lived in proximity to the Historical Society. I think his home was at the corner of Locust and High Street, which is interesting because obviously he's Irish and he's not living in Corky Row. He's one of the early settlers in Fall River. I was very impressed to find that he was involved in anti-slavery meetings and interacted with Frederick Douglass. He was a successful entrepreneur. In 1854, he was listed as paying more in taxes they had a tax system that, I don't know how that worked exactly, but depending on your annual income, you paid a certain amount of money.
They did it. The way the tax system worked, I looked this up because I was looking up Andrew Borden. Okay. So the tax rolls, the taxation system, those books are at the Historical Society. Yeah. So you were taxed on your property. Okay. You were taxed for a poll tax. And you were taxed on your money in the bank. Oh, so however much money you had, how much cash you had, you were taxed. So they were taxing everything down the line because there wasn't a state tax. Okay. The state wasn't taking a tax. And I think this is before the federal income tax. Okay. So
it would be before the federal.
But there was also a school tax. Okay, so school tax based on where you live, there's asset tax, there's property tax, and there's what's in your bank tax. Okay. That's interesting.
It is. So in 1854, again, the year that the Fall River community becomes a city, there was a list of people worth $10,000 or more. And there were about 100 names listed. And Richard Borden paid the most, but he's worth supposedly $213,000. Now, David A. Brayton was worth a little over $13,000 in 1854. John Collins was worth more than $15,000. So he's well established. He actually tried to raise a regiment of Irish volunteers during the Civil War. He tried to establish a packet line going between Fall River and Galway, and he had some Yankee investors, so he's respected in the community. He died suddenly in 1871, and the conservative Republican Albion Milne Daily News said this: "He, Collins, possessed more than ordinary share of ability and soon became quite prominent as a businessman, and by his energy and enterprise succeeded in acquiring a handsome profit."
So he was a local businessman.
Oh, yeah. He's making all his money, and he's successful. So this is an example of the Irish beginning to break into high society and being respected for
But he doesn't own a brewery, or he's...
He does not.
Okay.
I'm pretty certain that he does not.
Okay.
But that's a good question, because that's going to lead us to Lizzie Borden.
Yeah, where he make
family.
his money. Yeah. So how did the Irish advance after the Civil War?
Well,
I guess, society and culture and politics.
In 1855, there was a gathering of a literary society, an Irish literary society, in the downtown town meeting, and it was very favorably reported upon by the Daily Evening News. and there were readings and poetry, etc. So there's always a segment of society that's not, out drinking all the time and being lowlifes. So there is this leadership that has emerged in the Irish Catholic community, and it's happening around the country. So two of the great quotes that I've always loved, and this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells speak to the Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God. So that sort of summarized the old Yankees, especially in Boston, but also in a place like Fall River, were in charge. But over time, there was a new ditty. Here's to the city of Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Flanagans govern the Lowells and even monopolize God. So the Irish are moving ahead in this state. I think we're heading towards the James Michael Curleys of the world and Irish political success.
How did Yankee society react to all of this?
It was a mix. It was definitely a mix. There was a sense of tension, but there was also a recognition that you can't prevent it from happening. You can try, but it won't be totally successful, so that when you start looking at the graduates at the New Durfee High School, there's always a smattering of Irish that are coming from middle-class homes. It's just a matter of time.
Well, Lawler talks about that in his book about the Irish lad in Fall River, because he said he realized very early on that he had a choice. One was to work in the mills the rest of his life, or the rest of his life he could get an education. And an education was a way out.
Right.
And he did, and it was.
It was. And Dr. Tony Coelho, for a native who did his doctoral dissertation at Brown, has focused on the Irish and upward mobility in the 19th century. And what he's able to show is that in the first generation of the Irish in Fall River, almost 80% of the male children did better in life economically and in job position than the parent had done. So
the American dream.
The American dream. Now, there's always some people that slid behind. Some people did not do as well, but almost 80%, that says everything.
But there was still this anti-Irish sentiment,
for sure.
Big time.
For sure.
That continued past the Civil War into the 20th century.
It did. And in that sense, Dr. Curry, I wanted to bring your attention to a 3-part series that was produced in the Andover Review in the 1880s. The Andover Review is a religious and theological monthly...
I've read this.
Okay.
I know what you're going to say.
Good,
yes.
Good. So the author is William W. Adams.
Reverend, right?
Reverend, Doctor of Divinity, pastor of the First Congregational Church, Fall River, Massachusetts, writing in this national journal a very erudite and detailed article, balanced to some degree, and not one-dimensional in casting blame, sort of. But let me read something that you've read. He wrote, the operatives were Americans, talking about the evolution in Fall River. The operatives were Americans, or as we said, the old Yankees. Not a few of them owners of stock in the mills where they worked, but foreigners soon took their place, poorer in purpose, inferior in intelligence. They worked more continuously than the Americans and more contentedly at low wages. That is absolutely false. It's a misreading of Fall River history. The people that worked at low wages in Fall River were the native Yankees. It was the Irish and the English immigrants that stood up to management and demanded better pay and better hours. But again, once you establish that idea that the old Yankees are the only superior group, then you can continue on. It may properly be inferred that there's very considerable difference in the intelligence of operatives. The fullest intelligence is found in the best classes of the Scotch and the English, of course.
Protestants.
But there's a qualification. The majority of the English are large consumers of beer. The Irish are seldom of high grade. They are the least steady in their work. They drink whiskey and are vigorous politicians with an eye to the spoils. Canadian French are the latest comers and on the average represent the lowest grade in the development of humanity.
Reverend Adams. Yes.
And again, he tries to be semi-complimentary at times. But what he says is the people such as himself, the Yankee leadership in a community, what you need to do is suppress pauperism. And that gets right back to Mayor Blaisdell. Mm-hmm. The whole idea is to not let people expect relief should they face unemployment situations.
So he had a solution.
He had a solution for people that wanted to live off government and not work. Restoring the whipping post.
Oh, what a nice man!
But don't publicly embarrass the person. Flogging in seclusion would not demoralize them and could scarcely demoralize the criminal. So the biggest needs for society was, quote, a thoroughly organized and sharply discriminating system of private charity, better than public taxation. John Boyle O'Reilly said it best. I've quoted it, love the quote. Organized charity skimped and iced in the name of a cautious statistical Christ. What the Adams of the world wanted was basically Protestant people go around and talk to these poor Catholics and then find out they're not deserving of any kind of assistance. Mm-hmm. And it's a theme, of course, that we still have today. The other thing that would make for a better world was public schools only. Again, criticism of the commonplace Catholic schools in Fall River. And one of the results was that is if you wanted to go to Durfee High School, you had to take a separate entrance exam if you were in a Catholic school, graduating from a Catholic school, which did not apply to youngsters that were graduating from a public high school.
It's meant to keep people out, not accept the best and the brightest.
Exactly. Now, I'm going to qualify something I said earlier, and, it's pretty commonplace knowledge at this time, but the magnificent gift of Mary Brayton Young and family in the building of the original magnificent B.M. Sir Durfee High School came with the qualifier that the school committee could not appoint teachers, but that there had to be a separate committee that would do so. And on that committee was Reverend Adams, who we've just been talking about. And I think everybody that follows Forever History knows where I'm going here. There might be some Irish-American students, but they could not look up to Irish-American faculty because there were none of them. And that was a reality that lasted into the 20th century.
So is this guy, Adams, he's also a temperance guy? Is that what I'm getting at? He seems pretty severe.
That's the other thing. The idea is this is the hope of the Yankee community. If there's one thing we can hopefully continue to do, it's to keep temperance as the predominant reality in Fall River.
So wait, so Adams is the First Congregational Church.
Yeah.
That's Andrew Borden's church.
Okay.
So Andrew Borden goes to First Congregational Church.
Andrew Borden,
and Lizzie goes to Central Congregational Church.
And Andrew's, I assume, a teetotaler.
He is a teetotaler.
Yeah.
And as is Lizzie. So they actually are temperance people.
Right.
And when she's on trial, the temperance people come out of the woodwork to support her. She also has a chapter of the WCTU in the Borden building, Andrew Borden's building in Fall River. They rent a space there. She is a temperance person. Mm-hmm. Her family's temperance. Temperance means no alcohol.
Right.
At the same time, you've got Cogswell, a dentist from California,
yes,
roaming the country and thinking, if I can provide a fountain with fresh
fountain
water, then people will stop drinking.
Right.
And so he donates out of his own pocket and builds fountains in various cities in this New England area. There's one in Fall River. Mm-hmm. He dedicates it and invents this way to refrigerate the water, but it requires the city to put blocks of ice underneath the bottom. And he also donates one to Washington, D.C. and Boston, and there's all of these cities that have these temperance fountains.
Right.
And it absolutely didn't work. Water was not a substitute for a bar.
Right.
But there were bars everywhere in Fall
There were.
River.
But let's backtrack a bit so that we don't have these generalizations that there are major exceptions, and temperance is the most significant one. The Irish community split.
Yes.
And
there were drinking Catholics, drinking Irish and non-drinking Irish.
Correct.
Yes, temperance
and
Irish.
And the leading advocate for non-drinking in the 19th century was our friend Pastor Murphy. And he organized a temperance society and was its president for 20 years. And he would certainly sermonize against the evils of drinking. Father Matthew Theobald came from Ireland in the 1840s to America, and he visited Fall River, and he was a famous temperance advocate. He got people to take a pledge, and the question later was that pledge temporary or was it supposed to be lifetime? There'd be debate about that. But when he came to Fall River, he was the guest of Dr. Nathan Durfee at the Durfee residence. And at the time, the Irish were not interacting in terms of somebody visiting and living with a Yankee.
Yankee of some prominence.
So that was perfect. So Father Murphy was then respected by a great element of the Yankee community going forward because of his position on temperance.
Well, in a way, by he's trying to get people to be healthier.
Oh yeah,
and take care of your families, and it doesn't hurt that it's a political win for the Irish to be seen as temperate.
Right. There's a quote about the women who have had people in their family that have been taken hold of by the liquor, and that's the reality. There were so many bars and so many
every corner
husbands not acting appropriately in terms of their habits or their loss of income at the bar rooms. But temperance was always also seen in the 19th century as the old Yankee trying to control society through temperance. And that brings us to the Irish and a different kind of separation. So there's a separation about drinking in the Irish community. Okay? There's also the reality that the Irish will have tremendous success politically beginning in 1885 with the election of John Cummings as the first Irish-American mayor.
And at one time the youngest elected mayor in the city's history.
And a friend of John Boyle O'Reilly. And now what's happening is Sacred Heart Church, our parish, has been founded by this point. So the lace curtain Irish, or the middle class, are beginning to have success in the business community, owners of stores, etc. A few in high mill positions at this point. So that we can see that movement away from Corky Row by successful Irish people, leading to the formation of Sacred Heart Church in a better part of the city. My long-term interpretation, I know I'm spot on, is that the Catholic community then had its final achievement by buying the property of Seth Borden and constructing Holy Name Church in the 1940s. And in architectural fashion, having a church, a beautiful church that almost looked like it was a Protestant church. Simple and beautiful, but saying to the Yankee community, we have arrived in the high Highlands. We have achieved at your level. And that's the long-term situation. But let's go back to what happens in the 1880s. Again, it's the press. The Fall River Globe. The Fall River Globe is the Irish Democratic newspaper. And it is controlled by John Cummings and his friends who are first-generation Irish. It's really fascinating because the issue that divides the community is the no license issue. The Protestant Republicans create a Citizens Law and Order League, which is something that Reverend Adams very much endorses. And the Law and Order League in Fall River is led by one Andrew J. Jennings. And what they would do is they would pay people called spotters, and these people would go into a bar or a saloon and order a drink, and once they got a drink, there'd be reason to arrest the person that owned the saloon.
Why?
For a reason I'll explain. So the people that owned the saloon started to call Andrew Jennings Saint Jennings, but that was said with sarcasm.
Of course.
As if he was better than anyone else in the city.
Right.
Now, I mentioned the Daily Globe, but there was also the Fall River Daily Herald. And this is a little bit confusing, but the Fall River Daily Herald was, in the 1870s, controlled by Irish American capital. But over time, it became more conservative. And so it didn't always represent what the Irish wanted it to represent. It was sort of waffled someplace in the middle. But more importantly, this defines the split in the Irish community. So John Cummings is elected in 1885. The Fall River Globe tries to take over the Fall River Herald. The board of directors is led by Dr. John Coughlin, or Coughlin, but Coughlin, I think you would say.
Mm-hmm.
And he is called a juvenile Caesar and critiqued by the Globe. So what happened is Globe tried to buy out the Herald secretly, and it led to a court case. And the court ruled that it was an attempted hostile takeover. And so the Herald was not taken over by the Globe. So the reality is that the Irish are split between the first generation, which follows Cummings, and the Fall River-born second generation, which follows a younger Coughlin.
Coughlin is the teetotaler, or
No.
is it the other way around?
No. This is a split within the Irish community.
But it's not related to temperance?
It's not related to temperance.
Okay.
Because Cummings and Coughlin both are on the so-called wet side. It was the wets against the dries.
So the newspaper differences were wets and dries?
No.
No, okay.
So the Daily News would be the dry paper, the Protestant dry paper.
The Daily News is the
that we talked
Protestant
about.
dry paper,
Yeah,
right.
Almy and Milne. Yeah, okay.
So now we've got three papers. We got the Daily News, we got the Daily Herald, and we have the Globe.
There were others at times,
Right.
but those are the two. So
The
so
three.
that's the breakdown of the three.
Okay.
And the news is very much the conservative on any economic issue. Protestant.
Dry.
And dry.
Okay.
Okay.
But Coughlin is the head of the board of directors of the Herald.
Right.
And Cummings is
The Globe.
the Globe.
And the Globe is trying to gain control of the Herald, and they
Right.
failed to do so. But the reason is because there is a split, as I said, between the first two Irish generations. So Cummings' best friend is Quinlan Larry, and Quinlan Larry is the biggest wholesale liquor dealer in Fall River. And when Cummings is mayor, if you own a bar or saloon, you better buy from Quinlan Larry,
I see.
or they will try to do something using their political influence against you. So there's tremendous tension between the two. But the important thing is the Irish have now achieved, if you will, the ultimate political success, because in a 10-year period, Cummings and Coughlin are mayor for 7 of those years. So the Irish really have arrived politically. Now, what drives the Adams of the world to probably near insanity is that every year there's a vote about whether the city should be wet or dry. And one year, when Coughlin is mayor, the dries win. So this doesn't look good. And it's not total because 72 licenses are given out. Okay, so the dries have modified. They're not going to say there can't be any bars or saloons in the city, but there's a lot more, as you've indicated, there's a lot more than 74 licenses. But here's the deal. You have to, if you have an open bar, you have to pay a federal tax. okay? You have to purchase a license from the federal government to have your bar on 3rd Street. 524 taxes were paid, even though legally only 74 licenses were granted. So the city voted dry, but John Coughlin told the police, look the other way when you walk by saloons.
Oh, I see.
So, this infuriates the Drys. We've got control over the liquor situation.
But you have...
But in fact, nothing has changed.
But because you have a mayor who is...
Right. The mayor just said...
Okay. All right. So here's the Lizzie connection that we've been waiting for. So you've got Andrew Jennings, who is a teetotaler, who is a dry, who is actually involved politically in temperance.
Correct.
Lizzie, temperance, Protestant.
Right.
Jennings, Protestant.
Right.
So he is Andrew Borden's attorney during his lifetime. Mm-hmm. And then when Lizzie gets into her trouble, Emma hires him as Lizzie's attorney. So he becomes Lizzie's attorney that day of August 4th, 1892. He's brought into the case. From what you're telling me, we have a Mayor Coughlin, who is the antithesis of Jennings.
Correct.
In his political beliefs and he's a wet, I guess you'd say.
He's a wet.
So he looks the other way for bars. He has no problem with alcohol being sold.
Right.
And then he insinuates himself into the Borden case.
Yes, and as I wanted to say, he describes Lizzie as being haughty at one point.
Right.
And he's the one that tells us she's under...
Right. So Saturday after the funeral, he shows up, Coughlin, and has a conversation with Jennings present and she says, am I suspected? He leads her to believe that they suspect her. And he's the mayor. He's not a police officer.
Right.
But he certainly has authority in that regard, because while he's not in charge of the police, he is a representative of the government. Mm-hmm. So he comes and he sits in that house and he tells her that she is suspected, with Jennings sitting right there. To me, that puts a different spin on why he came over and told her that. He's putting something in the nose of Andrew Jennings. He's rubbing Andrew Jennings' nose into something. He's acting as an antagonist to Andrew Jennings, not to Lizzie, who he probably doesn't care about in the slightest.
Right.
But to Jennings, who's sitting right there next to him, who's like a political foe, all about alcohol.
Correct.
It just seems so absurd, and yet somehow there's this relationship that I didn't even know existed between these two men and their power struggle.
There is a definite power struggle. Yet there's this fascinating split between the two successful Irish mayors, but they come together in the 1890s, and it's because there's a modified form of know-nothingism in an organization called the American Protective Association of the 1890s, and it tries to sort of resurrect the know-nothing approach to political life. And it's so offensive that Cummings and Coughlin sort of bury the hatchet, and they combine to go after or to critique this APA, which was the type of organization that would have the full support of the news. Mm. And so, it again, this interesting...
it's also interesting because the Globe is the newspaper that goes after Lizzie year after year after year after year, and has a bias against her in its reporting. And Edwin Porter, who worked for the Fall River Globe as a reporter, when you read his reports, appears unbiased. His book, The Fall River Tragedy, is unbiased. He doesn't say anybody did it. He doesn't blame her. But then, of course, he was under he was warned not to, because even though she was acquitted, that he could not say that she had been the killer. He could not make an opinion known in that book, and he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So he was well regarded as a journalist for the Globe, but the Globe incessantly, almost every year, but not every year, brought the case up again, and on the front page or on the front page of a separate section would bring up the murders again and again and again.
Right.
And this is a Catholic, pro-Catholic newspaper.
Yes.
Against a Protestant woman who they feel got away with murder.
Right. We can understand the roots of that hostility, I think, based on what we've been discussing.
Right.
And also...
But John Cummings, who his grandson...
Yes.
...is a friend of ours.
Correct.
And he tells the story of representing Bridget Sullivan, that his grandfather represented Bridget Sullivan because he was a lawyer. And she was Catholic.
Yes.
And so he could never bring himself to get involved on Lizzie's side because she was Protestant. So there was a prejudice, bigotry against the Catholics from the Protestants. There was a bit of that from the Catholics to the Protestants as well, wasn't there?
The dominant pastor of St. Mary's in the 1890s wrote a tract in which the basic theme was there's no eternal salvation outside the Catholic Church. So again, you have that hard line from our perspective, bigotry, and yeah, it's all there. What I'm fascinated by is the geographical location of the Borden house, so close to St. Mary's Cathedral, and what
catty corner almost from it. Yeah.
And what was their thoughts about the Catholic Church? I mean, it was all around them, the Irish Cocky Road neighborhood, some of the night watch stuff that we laughed about.
Oh, yeah, and I was going to ask you, why were all these Irishmen police officers?
Well, that's politics. As soon as you get a mayor...
Oh, they're appointed by the mayor.
Yeah. And you can see that. And interesting thing is there's always a higher percentage of police than firefighters, because the firefighters have to live together. And so there'd be more resistance by the powerful group to the newer group coming into their midst. But it's fascinating.
Well, Coughlin used the case, the Borden case, as a justification for increasing the budget for the Fall River Police Department to hire more people and to promote people from within. And a lot of the Lizzie Borden investigators, police officers, were promoted to lieutenants and captains.
Oh, yeah, there's as I recall, predominance of Irish Catholic names on the police force.
Absolutely.
It relates to that time. And
Absolutely.
That's the evolution that's going on. I was hoping to find some information about whether Bridget Sullivan attended St. Mary's Church.
Well, she lived right there. I imagine she would.
If she had retained her faith. Yeah, no, I got to look at all the primary sources. The baptisms and marriages were preserved, so obviously...
Yeah, but she wasn't baptized there or married there.
That was the problem. I was hoping there was more, and there isn't.
So there's no list of congregants.
But their choice of living there, and Dr. Dolan, right? There's an Irish presence.
Well, yeah, because, the family physician for the Bordens was a Protestant, Dr. Bowen. They were surrounded by physicians.
Correct.
Dr. Kelly lived next door, Irish. Dr. Chagnon lived catty corner behind, and he was French-Canadian.
That was upward mobility for the French-Canadian, not to be living in the Flint, but to be living in a more prosperous middle-class area of the city.
Coughlin is Irish, and he's a doctor and a mayor.
Right.
So you had all of this, the Protestants stuck together, let's put it that way, and were Congregationalists, basically, Central or First. And the rest of the minorities, besides the English, were Catholics.
Right.
So you had Notre Dame and St. Anne's and Sacred Heart and on, and Catholic churches everywhere.
But the other thing that we should focus on is the anger in the Irish community, and it would be for the Cummings followers and the Coughlin followers at what was going on with the newly built Durfee High School, and the fury they would have felt
being excluded from public education.
That there's this separate deal where a group of people can take a public institution and say no Catholics can be hired.
Is it no Catholics or no Irish?
No Catholics.
Okay.
But the only consideration at that time basically was the Irish. There were very few Francos attending Durfee High School, but there were a number of Irish kids at that point. The tensions are so dramatic, and I'm not sure. My parents' home on Madison Street, there was a Buffington family across the street, and there was a little woman that we called Irish Mary. And my mother, who was a very holy, pious Catholic, would go over on Sunday morning and ring the doorbell and take Irish Mary a few hundred feet to Holy Name Church. But basically that was the only time Irish Mary was out of the house during the course of the week. And so we don't know the relationship, or you do more than anyone else, of the Green Woman or Bridget Sullivan, and how the Borden family reacted to them, really thought about them.
Well,
was the Catholic component of there?
Well, let me put it this way. When Lizzie got her own place on the hill, sort of on the hill, she never hired Irish.
But she was a friend of Mr. Lomax at the cemetery, who I believe would have been Catholic.
Yeah, but he was kind to her and showed her the grave. And yes, no, I'm not saying she's bigoted.
No,
I'm just saying that the people that she hired were Scandinavian.
Yes.
They were different immigrant class completely than what she was used to, which were Irish maids and Irish housekeepers. Yes. So I'm assuming, I may be wrong, Scandinavians are Protestants.
They are.
In a way, she kept it close to her chest.
Yeah, and she may have had negative thoughts about, say, Mayor Coughlin when she decided what might the background be of my next maid hire.
Well, yeah, or Bridget Sullivan herself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's something we haven't really focused on, but the location, every day there would be major events, parades and everything that would have gone right by their home. Or there'd be a milling of people every Sunday at least around. People went to St. Mary's Church all parts of the day for Vespers, besides Mass, etc. In other words, it was a constant activity. The school. I mean, there's just a Catholic presence near their home that nobody, I think, really focuses on. That's
because there's no writing about it.
I know.
They didn't keep diaries and write about their experiences.
Right.
She never said what it was like growing up in Fall River. She never talked about it, and we only have to assume. But you're right.
But it didn't bother his father so much so that he'd want to move from that location.
No, his businesses were there. He was strictly involved in the business aspect of his life.
Right.
He was strictly business when it came to that. I don't think he had there's no indication that he was a bigoted person.
Right.
But just he did business to make money. Mm-hmm. Which is nothing wrong with that.
No.
I don't have a sense that no one can have a sense of what their practicing relationship was with Catholics.
Right.
But we do know that they remained Protestant. She remained Protestant her whole life. And at one point, Bishop Cassidy he went around to all the rich Protestant women who were widows or unmarried who had money and land, and wrote them letters and asked for them to come and be a part of the Catholic Church or to donate money or to, be a sponsor of this and that. So he was not dumb in reaching out to people with money.
No.
But he was rebuffed by all of them. So.
But he was able to, establish the bishop at on Highland Avenue, et cetera. So again, that's sort of
around the corner.
Sort of an arrival, and he was a powerhouse. And the other interesting thing about was, he's a dry. Cassidy is associated with teetotalism like nobody else, and the Catholic CYO on Anawan Street. Mm-hmm. That I grew up playing basketball. Everything happened at CYO. But that building is a Young Men's Irish Temperance Society building.
Oh, wow.
And Cassidy, actually, he went after the Globe in later years.
Yes, he did.
And part of it was because the Globe was part of the Cummings family, and he didn't like the fact that there was liquor, and the Globe was supported by a lot of liquor ads, and he vehemently opposed liquor. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. There was a candidate that would have been a candidate for mayor after World War I named Billy Sullivan, and he had all the assets and attributes of a potential good mayor. I think he graduated from Brown. He may have been a heroic officer in World War I, very, very credentialed. But he lost a bid for mayor because Cassidy spoke at the pulpit and asked the congregants not to vote for candidate Sullivan. What was his flaw? His father had been a saloon owner.
Oh my goodness. I can only sigh at all of this. It's food for thought. It doesn't answer any questions.
It does not answer questions.
It raises more than you would imagine, but it certainly puts some things in context that I hadn't ever heard before or thought about, especially the way the newspapers were. I mean, people say things like, oh, well, the Globe was against Lizzie, but why?
Yeah, and the tension and the roots of that tension that go back generations. I mean,
to the founding
certainly
of the city.
The Know Nothing movement. If you are born in the 1870s, you've got parents that will tell you, guess what happened back when this city was formed, what they tried to do to us, etc. So, this has a long-term impact.
It really does. It really does.
And then to have it resurrected again in the 1890s, although on a more modified basis, as it turned out, would be enough to, again, obviously there's a dramatic animosity between the two mayors, but to have them work once again over the religious issue of anti-Catholicism is fascinating.
From a state that created the Kennedy legacy.
Right.
It's a strange world we live in. And Massachusetts is endlessly fascinating.
Oh, indeed.
Endlessly fascinating in its history and its complications coming from the beginnings. I mean, the birthplace of America is here.
And the absolute success of the Catholics that we haven't talked about and we can just brush through, but that they were able to eventually get Catholics teaching at Durfee, and they were able to get a majority on the school committee that were Catholics. They even got a French priest to be on the school board. And the French and the Irish had animosity. We didn't get into that. The French were Republicans because of the competition with the Irish, who were Democrats. So the French were great for the old Yankee, like the Florida Daily News, because they were anti-Irish in politics.
And how many Catholic presidents has the United States had? 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
John F. Kennedy and Joseph R. Biden, and that's it.
Right.
And so it goes. It's very interesting.
It is. It's fascinating, actually. And I could even get into John Cummings was a conservative Democrat. In other words, he might not, if there was a strike or something, he might be opposed to it. He was sort of an upper class. The Irish tried to emulate the Yankees when they were successful. Yeah. The Hudner family would send their children to prep school, like the upper class.
I can understand Adams being upset that there's so many poor people. And as a man of the cloth, trying to find a way to fix that.
Right.
But he became a man who looked at poor people as if it was their own fault.
Correct.
Which
and identified
today.
Those poor people as being Catholic.
But it still exists today.
It does.
It's their fault.
It does.
You just get up and go to work, and you solved your problem, is the easy answer that people... But that's not the truth of people's lives.
Correct.
But he's blaming it all on the Catholics.
Indeed. That's.
How can a man of God be such a blatant bigot and he not hear himself? It's certainly not the teachings of Christ.
No.
I don't understand that part. I don't understand how people could be prejudiced or anti any kind of group of people and call themselves Christian.
Well, it's a parochialism, and it's not ecumenical. As we said, and it cut both ways. I mean, the pastor of St. Mary's certainly was a bigot in terms of saying...
Yeah, to the French. Yeah, but that's the other Catholic
No,
side.
but I mean, bigot in terms of saying nobody Catholics will go to heaven, that type of thing. It's a siege.
It's inciting.
It's a siege mentality.
They're inciting.
Yeah, it's very siege mentality. You know, we've got some...
We're the only religion.
Right.
Right.
And and that happens in a lot of cases in our society. We're the best. We're the only right way to do things.
We're the only smart ones.
Smart.
Everybody else is a big drain on the system.
Right.
And
yeah.
I don't want to pay for that.
Yeah, this can't be siphoning off all of this.
Even though democracy is all about great compromise.
Right.
I pay for your kids to go to school, and I don't have any.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there is compromise.
Well, I want to thank you very strongly for this conversation. I think it was enlightening for probably our listeners and certainly for me. And I read your dissertation, both volumes.
Bless you.
Needs to be a book. And that was the first time I was exposed to this very stark examination of bias in the news media in Fall River and what that meant to politics and who was elected and why, and the labor movement. And it's complex but endlessly fascinating. And so I hope that we get to publish your book sometime soon, because I think it's worthy of publication and without much editing at all.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And thank you for speaking with us for so long today.
My pleasure, believe me, my friend.
Toodaloo. Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 31. We've been talking to Dr. Philip T. Silvia Jr. on the subject of early immigration, especially Irish immigration, in Fall River and the impact it has had on the city's history. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube.